Hi everyone, Heather Liu here to talk to you about my top tips for getting beautiful top stitching on denim and other heavy duty fabrics. This is a subject that is very close to my heart because at Closet Core Patterns we've released a ton of denim focused patterns, from jeans to coveralls like this. And I've also taught, I don't know how many people in person how to sew jeans, like hundreds at this point. And so I'm very familiar with a lot of the problems that you are going to encounter when you're trying to top stitch denim. I've encountered them myself. I've sewn so many different pairs of jeans on different sewing machines. I kind of understand how wide the problem is. And I would say that in general, if this is something that you're struggling with, it's like a combination of like needle, thread, or machine. And so I want to just really break down some of my top tips for getting beautiful, even top stitching, regardless of what machine you're using. The number one most important tip when you are doing top stitching, whether it's canvas or denim or any kind of heavy fabric, is using the right needle. So we love organ needles. We stock them at Core Fabrics. And there is a denim specific needle that you should be using for top stitching. Why is that? Well, the hole that the thread goes through on the needle in a denim needle is a little bit wider, so it can account for a thicker top stitching thread. And then the way that the point on the needle is designed is also designed to kind of get through that kind of like tight twill weave and to help prevent skipped stitches. So if you are trying to use a regular needle, especially if it's on the smaller end, like a 10, a 12, even a 14, you're just gonna have problems. The needle's probably gonna break because it's not strong enough. And what you might notice is the top stitching thread kind of getting shredded inside the needle, and that's because that hole that it goes through inside the needle is so small that as it's puncturing the fabric, the thread is kind of starting to fall apart. That's something I notice a lot. So before anything else, make sure you're using either top stitching or denim specific needle. Second most important thing, if not the most important thing when you're top stitching, is choosing the right top stitching thread. At this point, I've sewn dozens of garments using top stitching thread. I've kind of tried almost everything on the market. And I really strongly recommend using Gutermann top stitching thread that's designed for domestic sewing machines. You might find other top stitching thread through companies like Mettler or something like that, but you really want to choose top stitching thread that is made for domestic sewing machines like this one. So back in the day, we used to do these denim kits, and the thread that we were including in this kit, it's Mara 30, and it's on these big industrial spools, and for years this is the only top stitching thread that I used. But what I kind of noticed was, depending on my machine, it worked well, but if I was teaching in another place and I was using a different sewing machine, I noticed that shredding issue I mentioned before is really common on Mara because it's a really thick thread. So the Gutermann thread, and they have two kinds. There's just like the regular top stitching thread, and then they also have the recycled top stitching thread, which is what we carry at Core Fabrics. We have both of these, but we do prefer whenever possible to be using the recycled thread. Both of these are designed for domestic sewing machines, and they should work with a denim or top stitching needle and not shred too much. That said, here's my third big tip. When you're using these threads, unless you're sewing on an industrial machine, you don't want to use top stitching thread in your bobbin. And I know that feels weird because you're like, I want the stitches to match, like I want that top thread and the bottom thread to match. But these domestic machines tend to struggle a little bit if you have top stitching thread in the bobbin and in the top. So really what is the most important is that thread that faces out that people are going to see. So that top thread, you use the top stitching thread. And then on the bottom, you can use just regular thread. And if you really want to be matchy-matchy, what I'll often do is I will buy a regular thread in the exact same color as my top stitching thread. And that, it just visually looks nice. There isn't, chances are nobody's going to see the underside of it, but if that sort of thing is important to you, you can do that. Otherwise, if I'm sewing like a indigo denim, I'll just use a navy thread in the bobbin, and that way it kind of sinks right into the fabric. You don't see it, and then from the top, provided you get your tension settings correct, you'll see that thread. So that's really a critical tip, is just make sure you're not using this in your bobbin. You're going to end up having issues. Now, sometimes you have a vision for a top stitching thread. Maybe it's a particular color and you can't find it in a top stitching weight, or maybe you want to start a project right away and you don't want to go to the fabric store or order the thread that you need online. So here's a little trick for getting the look of a top stitching thread without it. So many domestic sewing machines have two spools on the top. Some don't, but many do. Most modern machines do. That will allow you to thread 2 different spools through your needle, and it basically doubles the look of that thread, giving it a slightly thicker look. Now, if your machine doesn't have that double spool, you can buy these kind of independent thread racks. So it's got a heavy metal base, and it's got a long rod that sits in it. And so what you could do is put this next to your sewing machine. I'm missing the little spool in the center, but you would mount your spool in the center. You have the thread come up, you mount it through this little leg, and then you pass it through your machine, and that's how you can have 2 threads going at the same time. So that's another little trick. Either your machine hates top stitching thread and it never works, or you just kind of need top stitching thread right away. This is one little trick to get that look of a thicker top stitching thread without actually having to use it. My next tip for getting beautiful top stitching is really to figure out the tension on your machine, and it's going to differ a little bit from machine to machine. So sometimes your default setting to your machine, it's going to work great. You're going to have that regular thread in your bobbin. You're going to have a nice thick top stitching thread up top, and you're going to go use your regular settings, and it's just not going to be right. And it's really important, particularly if you're not using the same thread in the bobbin, that the tension's good, because these seams see a lot of stress, especially when you're wearing things like jeans and you're bending over, and you know, they're worn close to the body and see a lot of action. So you want to make sure you have a really nice strong seam with appropriate tension. So I want to show you a few examples of what your tension should look like, and then troubleshooting tension that's not good. So here's an example of perfect tension. So I have a nicely defined stitch. I can kind of see the stitch going in and out. I'm not seeing any of the bobbin thread come through the fabric. And if I turn it around, I've got a regular thread in the bobbin here, but I'm barely seeing the top stitching thread, and I see these nicely defined bobbin threads here as well. So this is perfect. Here's an example of the tension being too high. So from the outside, it might be hard to see on camera, but because the tension is so tight, it's pulling the bobbin thread to the front, and I'm actually seeing the kind of browny red thread pulling through. And if I turn it to the back, the bobbin, because it's so tight, there's a little bit less thread definition. The thread is pulled very, very tight, and it's being pulled up. And so this is also not ideal. Now here's an example where the tension is too low, and this is probably the thing you want to avoid the most, because when the tension's too low, on the back side, you're going to see that the top thread is not being held secure. You're going to see all these little loops, like you're seeing here. And if this is a seam, when that seam gets pulled apart, you have so much looseness in that thread that it's literally going to pull, like you're going to end up having a gap between your 2 pieces of fabric. So we are really aiming for that nice balanced stitch where you can really see the definition on the bobbin and the top thread, and you're not seeing either thread poke through to the front. So on your machine, before I ever top stitch, and even if this is my machine I've sewn on in 10 years and I know it backwards and forwards, before I go to sew my first pattern piece, I always get a couple of scraps. I thread my machine properly, and I make sure that the tension is correct before I start sewing the garment. And of course, it's going to vary from machine to machine. On the FAF machines we use, tension is automatically calibrated. We generally don't need to make too many adjustments. The machine kind of is making the appropriate tension. But if you have a tension dial on your machine, you're going to just want to be manually going up or down depending on the issue that you're having. You either want to turn the tension up or you want to turn it down to get it just right. So far we've kind of talked about tension and the right thread, but another thing that you might want to consider to get really beautiful top stitching is having specialty feet. Now I have gone and sewn an entire pair of jeans from start to finish using just basically your standard machine foot, and you can absolutely do that. But there's 2 feet that I find really helpful when you're doing top stitching. The first one is a 1/4 stitch foot. So this foot has a narrow opening for the needle. There's just a little tiny circle, so it doesn't have that big opening that a zigzag foot would have. And on this side, it gives me 3/8, and on this side, it gives me 1/4 inch. So if I line up my edge of my fabric with this line, I'm gonna get a perfect 1/4 inch stitch line. And a lot of denim, for example, what I'm wearing right now, in our patterns, for example, will always say, you know, you do your first line of top stitching 1/8 inch away from the seam, and then you're gonna do a second one 1/4 inch away. So I find a foot like this really helpful because I can use this inside guide right here. Let me point with my pen. It's 1/8 of an inch away from this circle to this line here. So I can use that to get my 1/8. And then when I sew my 1/8 line, I can line up the edge of this quarter stitch foot to that first line of stitching, and that's going to give me that really even quarter stitch line that you see kind of here, that really consistent stitching. And I'm going to show you how to do that in a minute, but it's this foot that kind of helps you do that, and it's got all of the guides that you need built into that foot, and it might look a little bit different depending on what machine you're using, but these are really common in quilting, so 1/4 inch feet are generally pretty easy to find. The other foot I find very helpful for top stitching is an edge stitch foot. So as you can see, it has this kind of little metal guide right in the center, and it shifts up and down with a little bit of pressure. And what this foot is good for is using that guide as a center line reference. So where could I show you on here? Let's say on this garment, I want to get 1/8 of an inch away from this folded seam. Obviously with a zipper here, that would be a little bit harder. But the nice thing about that edge stitch foot is I can align that guide down the seam line, and then I'm going to use my machine placement. I'm going to actually physically move the needle over on my machine rather than it sewing straight like it normally does. And then I'm going to use this little guide along that edge of the seam or along the center of a seam, and it's going to stay exactly where I want it, and the needle's moved over. And so that's how I get a nice consistent line of stitching that is parallel to a seam line. So these are 2 feet that are really nice to have, and if you're planning on sewing jeans or you're planning on sewing workwear, I recommend having these in your toolkit because you might find different applications for them. And sometimes what I'll find is that I'm switching feet. Like I might use a regular foot for doing all the seams, and then I'm going to do some top stitching, so I'll switch to an edge stitch foot, and then I'm putting a zipper in and I'll switch the zipper foot. So it's normal when you're making a complex project, like a jean jacket or a pair of jeans, that you might switch feet back and forth. So now I want to give you some tips for actually sewing your top stitching. First thing we can talk about is your stitch length. So it's really up to you. It's why I always really find this helpful to start on a scrap so you can kind of see visually what you like. Generally when we're doing a construction stitch, we're sewing 2 seams together, 2.5 is generally the typical stitch length. With a top stitching stitch, I like it a little bit longer, 3 to 4 millimeters. I think it just looks a little bit more pronounced. The stitch becomes more defined and more visible, which is what we want with top stitching. But I just encourage you to sit down at your machine and kind of identify what length that you like. The most important thing that you want to do when you're starting your top stitching is start at the right place. I'm just pulling my bobbin thread out right now. So often what I'll see people do, and often what I do when I'm not paying attention, is I'll start kind of too close to the edge of the fabric, and you almost start with a thread nest. And so whenever I'm starting a top stitching line, I just want to make sure I'm like, you know, a couple millimeters in. We're generally dealing with a 5/8 seam allowance, so you have room there. You don't need to be right on the edge of the pattern piece. And I like to start by kind of holding those threads with my finger and holding them out of the way to prevent thread nest, because with top stitching thread, it does tend to nest a little bit more often, and because the thread is so thick, it looks terrible. So whenever possible, I'm trying to avoid those thread nests. And here, I'm just adjusting my stitch length. Let's try a few different ones and we can kind of see what we like. But here, I'm gonna go at 2.5. I'm gonna switch to 3. And now I'm gonna go up to 4. Now, you can backstitch with top stitching thread. And if it's a really critical point, I often do. But again, because top stitching thread is really thick, sometimes what I'll just do is kind of just sew almost off the edge. And especially if that's in a seam that's going to get sewn and finished, that it's not going to unravel because we're going to be encasing this with serging or something. So I'm just gonna put this in front of the camera here so you can see. So here's a really short 2.5. Here I switched to 3, and here we're at 4. And for my preference, I prefer the look of that 4mm stitch. I just think it looks a little bit more defined and elegant. I also want to talk to you about chain stitching. So this is another way that we can kind of minimize, make it a little bit easier to start and stop those stitch lines, minimize the amount of like trimming we need to do, and it's kind of a little speed sewing trick. So if you're having to kind of do a lot of top stitching, you have a bunch of pockets you need to do, sometimes I'll just do them continuously, one after the other. I'm gonna show you how that works. So here's my first piece, and I'm gonna take my next piece and just butt it up right against that first one, and continue sewing. And so now I don't need to start and stop to trim my threads. And then when I can take them off, and I'm just going to go in and trim that thread in between, and I have this nice even stitching, and I didn't really need to worry about getting gummed up or jammed up at the beginning or the end. So I think one of the things that people struggle with the most when they are top stitching jeans is getting evenly spaced lines. And it's really gonna differ kind of drastically depending on your machine. Some machines, for example, this needle doesn't move. You don't have the option to move it to the left or the right. And if that's the case, what you need to do is get feet that provide the guides that you need to base your stitching off of. So let's say, for example, that this needle position doesn't move. It has to stay centered. In that case, I think I'm gonna go for a 1/4 inch foot, because what that'll allow me to do, if I take this piece of fabric, and let's say this is my, the edge of a pocket, for example, I'm gonna put that 1/4 stitch foot down. I'm going to align my edge of fabric with the inside edge of this, because I know it's about 1/8 of an inch. So here's my 1/8 stitch, and now I can use that 1/4 stitch foot, and all of this is without moving this needle. I can now align that stitch line with the edge of my 1/4 stitch foot, and that provides the guide that I need. So you can see this really even line of 1/4 stitching. But maybe your foot moves and you have a foot like this. You're using kind of a standard machine foot. Now what can be helpful here is moving that needle position. So using this as an example again, here we have, say the edge of a pocket. What I could do is align the folded edge of that pocket piece with the center line on my foot right there. And now I'm gonna move the needle over as much or as little as I want. I'm gonna do about 1.5 on this. Actually, maybe a little bit more. And now I am aligning that edge with that line, and the needle's moved over, so it's gonna give me the 1/8 I need. Now for my second pass, maybe I wanna move the needle to the other direction, because this foot, the distance between this line and this edge is 3/8 of an inch. So if I don't have a specialty foot, now I'm gonna maybe move that needle over so I can get, an approximate 1/4 inch depth between the needle and the edge of the foot. And now I'm gonna line up the stitch line I just made with the edge of the foot. And then that gives me my 1/4 of an inch. Now, third option, I use my edge stitch foot, and I'm gonna move the needle. Rather than with this foot, I lined up the edge of the fabric with the red marking. Here, what I'm gonna do with my edge stitch foot is actually align the edge of the fabric against the guide. So I don't really need, it's a little bit less for me to worry about, like it's naturally being fed along that guide, and I've just moved the needle over to get that even line of stitching. So there's a few different examples, and what I encourage you to do with your machine, get out some scraps and figure out what the easiest, quickest, and most convenient way for you to get those consistent lines of stitching. And then whatever you end up using, and especially if you need to shift your needle over or there's any specific things you need to change on your machine, just get a Post-it, write down your settings, because the thing about jeans is that you're switching between top stitching and regular thread, right? You're doing your regular seam, the hidden seam with regular thread. You're serging or finishing it, and then you're top stitching that seam in place. And so in between those two steps, you are switching between thread. So what I find helpful is if you need to move that needle position over, you just have it marked so you don't really need to think about it so much. You're like, okay, it's time for top stitching. I need to move the needle over 1 millimeter and I'm gonna use this foot. And again, it becomes, or I should say, it becomes a little intuitive the more that you do it. But it's just really going to depend on your machine, whether that needle moves over, what access, what kind of feet you have access to. But one way or the other, there's lots of ways to get to a beautiful, those even rows of top stitching. You have to play around and see what works for you. I just want to share a few other tips for getting even top stitching, particularly if you're doing a wider distance, because I find, an 1/8 of an inch and 1/4 of an inch, those are pretty easy to get. But what if you wanted to do like a 1/2 inch or a 1 inch wide top stitching line? How are you kind of getting that nice even line? So I'm just switching to a classic 1/4 inch foot right now. It kind of doesn't really matter what type of foot I'm using right now. And I'm moving my needle to the center position. And let's say for this example, I want a 1 inch top stitching line. Well, that's simple enough. I have a 1 inch marking here on my needle plate. So I can use this. But depending on your machine, you might not have 1 inches. So what I like to do in that case, like if you don't, or maybe you need to get to 1.5 inches and you don't have that marked on your needle plate like I do. All you're gonna wanna do is take a ruler and measure between here, wherever on the bed of your machine that distance is, and you could put a piece of masking tape to mark that line. You can take a stack of Post-its and stick it on that line, and then the kind of thickness of the Post-its almost acts like a guide that you can press your piece on to get a nice smooth line. But for me, I'm gonna use the mark. I'm gonna try to do 1 inch right now, and I'm gonna try to keep it aligned with the mark on my needle plate. And as I'm sewing, I know another thing people struggle with is just keeping it even, right? And not having little zigzags. And really, it's just about going slow. So right now, I have my machine set pretty fast. I might just want to slow it down. I have a setting on this machine where I can literally just slow it right down and just not really be in a particular rush to get anywhere. I think this is one of the biggest tricks to even top stitching, especially if you're a beginner, is just take your time. When you're rushing and you're speeding, that tends to be when things are getting a little bit skewed. And that means just keeping a really gentle pressure on your presser foot as you're going and just not rushing. The other thing I like to do, particularly if you need to turn a curve or turn a corner, is leaving your needle down when you get there. So if I'm sewing here and I know I have a corner coming up, I always want to leave the needle down so that I'm not having to readjust or lose my spot. It's really easy leaving that needle down to now kind of go in any direction that I need to go, and I'm gonna have a perfect corner where I left the needle down. The next thing I want to talk to you about is skipped stitches. And this is like the bane of your existence if you're experiencing them. I hate skipped stitches. They drive me freaking crazy. And we have people emailing our customer service, or we're talking about it on our crew forum. Like, I'm getting skipped stitches. I don't know what to do. I've tried everything. Nothing's working. So my first tip with a skip stitch is to make sure you're using the appropriate denim or top stitching needle. Because if you're using a regular needle and you're sewing through think about, when you're making a pair of jeans, sometimes you're sewing through 5 to 6 layers of denim. That is so much to expect from your machine. So you want to make sure that you're using the right needle for the job. But I often find with maybe like newer and less expensive, kind of more entry-level machines, they tend to really struggle sewing through all those thick layers of denim. And so you really just want to make sure you got the right needle, you got the right thread. And if you're still getting them and nothing is working, nothing, no matter what you try, one of my little tricks, because generally when you're getting a skipped stitch, it's at a really thick area. It's not generally just, you've got 2 pieces of fabric together. It's when you've got multiple pieces of fabric all joining and there's those really thick areas. I love this little mallet. You can go to any hardware store, buy a mallet for like $5-6. They're not expensive, but they will help flatten the seam. And so, for example, where you have a back pocket, think about a back pocket on a pair of jeans. So this seam is folded at the top. It might be folded again. And then the inside is also folded. So now we're talking about 6 layers of fabric. And now that's getting attached to another layer of fabric, so that's 7. So if I'm really having issues, that skip stitch tends to happen right around here where it's sewing through all those layers, and then it tends to even up around here. So if you get a mallet and you just really give it a good whack and flatten that area, give it a good press with a wood clapper if you have one, like this, and then give it a good smash with a mallet. And my recommendation is you do it on the wrong side of the fabric. So if there's any indents or anything like that from the mallet, you're not seeing it on the right side. That can really help. And if none of that is working, it might just be your machine. In which case, my recommendation is, the next tip, I guess, is to get a second machine. So especially if you are sewing a lot of workwear, jeans, things like that, you are going to get frustrated with the amount of switching that you have to do with threads. And it can be really, really convenient to just have two machines set up side by side. Maybe you have the slightly less powerful machine that is just doing regular thread. And then you can go and get a vintage machine, which you can generally find online for like $100. You can go to a thrift store or whatever. They're all over the place. Very easy to find all metal vintage machines that tend to be a lot more powerful. And even if it doesn't have all the features of the newer machine, you can just set that one up for your top stitching. So you're doing all your construction stitching on one machine, and then you've got the other one set up for top stitching, and it really makes the entire process a lot faster. And so, I wish that my advice wasn't to spend money, but if you are consistently having issues with skip stitches and you've tried and troubleshooted all the solutions I'm giving you, it might just be a matter of getting an affordable secondhand machine that can handle those more intense bouts of sewing that machines need to do sometimes. Speaking of skip stitches and uneven stitches and unsightly stitches when you're doing top stitching, one of the biggest issues when you're sewing jeans is that you're often you're flat, we're sewing, away we go on a seam, no problem. But then we have to attach something, or there's a shift in thickness. And so all of a sudden your presser foot is sewing, and then it approaches this level change, and they tend to get a little bit jammed up. And either, maybe the presser foot manages to get over that little hump, but then maybe the needle is kind of getting jammed in this area. And this is really common around yokes, for example. So you've attached your yoke to your back leg, you've maybe sewn that crotch seam, and now you have to go and top stitch down the entire crotch seam. And you're coming up with this problem because you're sewing along the yoke, but then all of a sudden we get to this really thick seam where it attaches to the back leg. And so in these cases, any place where there is a level change in your sewing, nothing could be more valuable in your sewing kit than this. It's called a hump jumper. It looks very strange. It's just a little piece of plastic. I find most modern machines actually include them. So if you're unpacking a new machine or you have this in your stash and you don't know what it is, it's amazing. It's a hump jumper. You can buy them online for a couple bucks. And I'm going to show you how this works. So here we are, we're sewing, la-di-da, all good, but we have this joint here that is much thicker, and I've just taken a piece of fabric and folded it 4 times. So we're now approaching a 4-level change. What's probably going to happen on your machine is your presser foot's going to get stuck here, your needle's going to get stuck here, and it's just unsightly. And so we're trying to get these nice evenly spaced lines of stitching, and it's really hard to do when you have these level changes. So what the hump jumper does is, as you're sewing and as you're about to approach this area, you can almost use it to see if it's about level. So there's 2 different thicknesses. There's this thinner side and this thicker side. So I think this thicker side would be a good option. So I'm going to raise my presser foot. There's a little slot here that I'm going to slide behind the presser foot. And then I'm going to keep sewing. And what happens is, as I approach this seam difference, there's no level change. The hump jumper has lifted up the presser foot and allowed me to continue sewing. So I'm going to have these really straight, even lines, and I'm not going to have these weird little short stitches right at that joint. So let's see what that looks like. As you can see here, these stitches stayed really nice and consistent. It's a great little trick. Now, if you don't have a hump jumper, it's not the end of the world. You can take anything that has a bit of thickness, anything that's a couple millimeters thick, and you can use it behind your presser foot. You're just not going to maybe have as much runway as I have here because of this gap. But even like a layer of fabric kind of turned up and put up and laid under your presser foot behind it will help. So that's it, my top tips for getting beautiful top stitching when you're sewing denim and other thick fabrics. I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions, if you're struggling, let us know in the comments. We'll be sure to answer. If you have any tips for doing top stitching yourself, we'd love to hear them. But thanks for watching. And if you like this video, like and subscribe so you'll see more from us. Thanks so much.